This video is about social and emotional development during adolescence. Starting with relationships, one thing that we see often in teens is conflict at home. So the family relationship sometimes is stressed during adolescence. Oftentimes this is a reflection of the fact that a teenager is somewhere in between a child and an adult. So the parents still want to protect the kids and control their lives, and children want to be autonomous and do things for themselves. So there's a lot of tension sometimes between teenagers and their parents. Parenting teens is a challenge. Here are some things that make for good parenting of adolescence. One important thing is connectedness, and that means a bond between the child and the parent. Family time is one way that this can be created. Things like sitting down for dinner at the table and parents asking the teenagers what's going on in your life. Of course, some teens don't want to respond to those questions, but the fact that parents ask them shows that they care and tries to build connectedness. Even though teens feel like they're already adults, they're not, so parents still need to monitor. Things like asking, who are you going out with? Where will you be? Who will be there? Are all examples of monitoring. Additionally, parents need to worry about monitoring things like computers and iPhones now that kids have access to all kinds of information from their smartphones or their mobile devices. One great challenge, but also a great benefit if it can be accomplished, is open communication between a parent and their teenager. This requires that the parent has set up an environment where kids feel comfortable coming to the parent about anything, knowing that the parent's not going to be judgmental, not going to be derogatory, not going to overreact. Kids who feel safe talking about their parents or anything are more likely to go to them when they have issues than kids who don't. And of course, some of the issues that we're talking about during adolescence are big issues, things like deciding whether or not to have sex, or engaging in drugs or alcohol, or maybe even some emotional problems like depression. And then finally, having appropriate control is a major challenge for a parent. This is sort of related to monitoring, but there are some times where it's okay for a parent to butt in and sometimes where it's not. It is okay, of course, for parents to ask, who are you going out with and where will you be? But it's probably not okay for parents to be sneaking into kids' rooms unless there's a good reason that makes a parent think that they need to and that the child is hiding something. If a parent is just sneaking into the kid's room and going through their things or invading the child's privacy without provocation, then the child is going to react really strongly and negatively to that. One of the things that parents are up against is the fact that peers have become extraordinarily important for adolescents. So peers can be good influences and they can also be bad influences. We often talk about peer pressure, but again, peer pressure can be good and it can also be bad. One of the ways that peer pressure can be good is through peer facilitation. And think of peer facilitation as happening when a teenager is too afraid to do something themselves, so they get a friend to go with them. So maybe a teen wants to try out for the school play, but he's nervous and doesn't want to go by himself. If he's able to recruit a friend to go and try out with him, and that gets him to the tryouts, then that's a good peer situation. The peer pressure that we tend to consider bad is actually deviancy training, and deviancy training is where we learn all of our bad things from our friends. So we learn how to do things like smoke or drink or race cars really fast. And then finally, peers provide a lot of social support, because remember, teens oftentimes feel like the world is a very dramatic place. Their emotions are all over their place. They don't have a frontal cortex yet to inhibit themselves. They have a lot of these things going on in their body. They're trying all kinds of new things like romantic relationships. There's all these stressors like college and what am I going to do with my future. And so it's a really turbulent time, a very exciting time too, but the kids rely on one another for social support. Going back to Erickson's theory, we're now in the stage where kids are dealing with identity versus role confusion. So kids are doing a lot of things to try on different identities during this period. They're seeking out, who am I? So they might do that through the group of friends that they hang out with. They might do it through the sports that they're involved in, or the choir they're involved in, or the religious groups they're involved in. They might do it with the kind of music that they listen to, with the kinds of clothing that they wear, with the kinds of drugs and alcohol that they do. And so the hope is that by the time they get to the end of adolescence, these teenagers will have a pretty good sense of who they are. They'll have a sense of identity. Two sub-areas of identity that I want to talk about. First is sexual identity. Remember, through puberty, we're now sexual beings as adolescents. Figuring out our sexuality can be challenging, in particular for people who have non-mainstream sexualities like bisexuality or homosexuality. So there are 4 stages to the process of sexual identity for these non-mainstream sexualities. The first is sensitization. This is probably something that's going to happen when a person is very young and they sort of feel different than their peers. For example, if you had a girl who was having a slumber party with her friends and they were talking about the boy band that was popular and how they thought all of them were cute, but this girl didn't really perceive any of them to be cute. She just sort of felt different from the group, like she didn't belong in that conversation. That would be sensitization. Stage 2 is in self-recognition. This is when a person starts to realize that they have a sexual identity. For a teen who's developing a non-typical sexual identity, this can sometimes lead to identity confusion. Questions about why am I different? In stage 3, there's identity assumption, and this is when a person would fully identify with their sexual identity, whatever it happened to be, homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, and are willing to acknowledge that about themselves. During this period, though, they maybe aren't telling other people, so if you have someone who's homosexual or bisexual, they probably aren't coming out of the closet at this point. And then finally in stage 4 you have commitment or identity integration, and this is where you do start to come out to the environment around you, to the world around you, and tell people about your sexual identity so that you've committed to it publicly. The other area of identity I want to talk about is ethnic or political identity. Both of those develop in the same way. The first thing in ethnic identity is unexamined ethnic identity, and this is when an individual doesn't really think about what ethnic group they belong to. For someone who's in the mainstream ethnicity, for example a white person in Idaho, they probably are in stage 1 because they don't really have to think about their ethnic identity. They're sort of like most of the other people around them, and they don't need to consider what makes them ethnically different. However, if you're in an ethnic minority, you probably do think about your ethnic identity. So for example, if you were Black or Basque in Idaho, you would probably realize that you belong to an ethnic group that was different than the mainstream. And you probably would start thinking about that. And that would move you into stage 2 of ethnic identity development, and that is the ethnic identity search. Starting to gather information about what it means to belong to your particular ethnic identity. And then finally, the last stage would be ethnic identity achievement, where a person has come to grips with their ethnic identity and fully accepted it and integrated it into part of who they are. Gender identity is another subform of identity that I want to talk about, and in particular I want to talk about the influence that media has on our gender identity during adolescence. We're going to talk about this differently for boys and for girls. So starting with girls, females in the media are represented in a very skewed way. So you can see all of these images. You'll notice that some of the things they have in common are extremely skinny girls who are very scantily clad and oftentimes in provocative positions. The one in the upper left-hand corner has a woman attached to a game console like she's an object that's meant to be played. And girls see images like this in the media all of the time, which builds into their identity about what it means to be a girl and what they need to look like. Of course, a lot of this is very unrealistic expectations and can cause girls a lot of problems when they're not able to make their bodies look like this, or when young girls try and start to sexualize themselves, which is something we're seeing happening more and more amongst younger and younger girls in the ways that they dress and the ways that they act. Additionally, if it's not enough that they use models who have body types that only approximately 2% of the girls in the world have, the media also alters these images. So on the right we have a picture of Mariah Carey in what she really looks like, and then on the left the cover of a magazine. And you can see that there are a lot of ways that her face on the left is different than her face on the right. This is because of airbrushing techniques. Essentially they've gone in after the fact and with a computer changed the structure of her face. This is really common in advertising and in modeling, where sometimes they'll even take different body parts from different girls to put them together to create one quote-unquote perfect girl. Again, setting a very high unrealistic standard. If you think about how this has changed historically, we can look at two models or sex symbols. On the left we have Marilyn Monroe, and on the right we have Kate Moss. Marilyn Monroe is reported to have worn a size 12, and models today wear something more like a size 0. So a lot of changes in girls' bodies and what's been considered to be beautiful. So one of the problems with this is that young girls oftentimes will have distorted body images after having looked at all of these images, when their normal body seems to be too big or too fat because it doesn't look like what they're seeing in magazines or on TV. And we can see this manifesting itself in the percentage of young girls who say that they're on a diet. If you ask 10 and 11-year-olds if they've ever dieted, quite a few will say yes, which is very disturbing. Here are some images now of males in the media. And what we see happening in most of these images is very muscular, very masculine, powerful images. And this sends messages to boys about what they should look like. And just like with the girls, this has changed across time. So we can look at the Batman character from the original Batman series and then the most recent Batman from the Batman movies. And what you see is that the original Batman had basically tights and a cape on. And on the right, we no longer see any tights, that's for sure. But we also see that it's not enough just to be strong, but we actually see accentuation of the muscles in the costume. So being bulkier and more defined and much bigger is better now compared to when the Batman started. This leads boys to be considering things like taking steroids to make themselves bulkier, which is just as unhealthy as some of the issues that girls are dealing with. Moving now to teen emotions, we mentioned before how teen emotions seem to be a roller coaster. They go up and down, they change really dramatically, and that they seem to be quite extreme. And we can think about this as an emotional roller coaster. And there's some reasons for this. Some reasons are direct effects. So we've already talked about the hormones that come with puberty, the estrogen and the testosterone, and these extreme fluctuations in hormones can cause fluctuations in emotions. Additionally, we talked about how the brain has a weak frontal lobe because of all that new growth. It's not doing a very good job of inhibiting, but we have a very powerful limbic system, which is our emotional center, so that the limbic system is kind of in control of the brain during this period, meaning our emotions are kind of in control during adolescence. But there are some indirect effects as well. So one is that we have a new expectations of maturity. After puberty, teens' bodies look like adult bodies, but remember their brain actually isn't quite there yet. But because they look like adults, we often expect them to start acting like adults. We expect them to get jobs, to save money, to be reasonable and plan for the future. And sometimes that puts a lot of pressure on kids to think about things like, where am I going to go to college? What am I going to be when I grow up? Also, we have a lot going on in the social relationships. Kids are trying on a lot of new identities, and sometimes that means kids move from different social groups to different social groups in an effort to try and figure out who they are. Also, their peers are on just as big of an emotional roller coaster as they are, so they're constantly dealing with the emotions of their friends. We know that teens often think that when they fall in love that it's the one for them, so if the relationship ends it feels like the end of the world, or they think that their love is going to last forever. So we see kind of intense connections. And then the stuff we just talked about with body image, a lot of young people feel very inadequate about their bodies because compared to what the images of beauty and masculinity are shown in the media, they're not measuring up. So they're constantly trying to change who they are, and that's a major challenge to our self-esteem and our emotions. And then finally, we talked about sex, and engaging in sexual activity is a really emotional experience. For some people this goes well, and for some people it doesn't. When teens have sex, there's a really high chance that it's not going to go well because you're not going to end up staying in a relationship with the person that you're having sex with, or the person you're having sex with is going to tell people at school about the sex, and that becomes embarrassing and everyone's talking about you. There's lots of different ways that this challenges teens. So overall, keep in mind that so much of teen behavior really boils down to development of what's going on in the frontal cortex and how all of those new cells keep us from having particularly great inhibition ability or decision-making ability or the ability to think about the future, and that's reflected in a lot of our cognitive and social developments as well.